I'm Femi, okay.
And I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Going on holiday, that is something that many people look forward to all year as a chance to get away from the stress of everyday life and let loose in a new place. But what if that new place is too crowded?
Can you relate? Whether as a tourist or a resident of a city catering to tourists, share your thoughts with us via Twitter or our live YouTube chat. Venice, Barcelona, Boracay, Machu Pichu. All of these popular destinations have become overwhelmed by tourists in recent years, and local residents are starting to say enough.
In June, a massive cruise ship crashed into a dock in Venice, injuring 5 people. The incident was the last straw for many local residents. Thousands gathered to protest the vessels and the tourists who ride in on them. Have a look at this.
When I see these big cruisers passing by, they cast a shadow on my entire home, and I feel a sense of doom.
Venice is a case study for what travel experts are warning will be the new normal from now on. That's thanks to a growing global middle class and cheaper airfares. So are cities prepared for overtourism? Here's what one eco-friendly travel group has to say.
In 1950, there were 25 million tourist arrivals worldwide. This number grew exponentially over the following 70 years and reached 1.3 billion by 2017. It's estimated it will reach 1.7 billion by 2030.
All over the world is what happens when an industry which has talked about being sustainable but has actually done very little begins to bump up against the limits of our environment and the physical limits of space. And it's in that sense, I think it's like a rash. It's all over the world.
Well, joining us to discuss overtourism today is Megan Epler-Wood from Reading, Pennsylvania. Megan is the director of the International Sustainable Tourism Initiative at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health.
Shwiti Banerjee joins us from New Delhi, India. She is a travel journalist and currently an editor for the Outlook Responsible Tourism Initiative. And finally, we have Dominic Standish. He is the author of Venice in Environmental Peril, Myth and Reality. Hello, everybody. Shwiti, you sent us some pictures. Gorgeous pictures. I'm going to show them to everybody on my laptop. This is a stunning place. First of all, where are we in the world?
This is Dubrovnik. I think most of the Game of Thrones fans
they know it.
in the audiences would immediately know it.
They're humming the song. This is King's Landing.
Yes, that's the problem.
Stunning picture. Now, why did you send us this picture first of all?
I think, this was in contrast to some of the other pictures that I sent you of the city, old town, where you could actually see just how many people were walking the streets that morning. It's that first view that we saw is something that takes your breath away. But it's these that make you think a little bit harder. And don't get me wrong, I'm from India. I'm used to crowds. I am part of the crowd myself. So I don't see it as being something that should shock a person like myself. But it did, purely because it seemed wrong to just have so many people walking through those beautiful streets and not really looking at the place. They were there. It was an idea of the place that they were there for, and not really Dubrovnik. It was King's Landing to most of them, and
so a classic example from your perspective of what overtourism is in 2019.
Yes, I would say so.
Okay.
So I'd love all of our guests to have a look at this on my screen here, just from Google, a couple of pictures, and our audience at home as well to see them. This is St. Augustine in the U.S. state of Florida. And I want to share with you a video comment from someone who lives there. He is a local business owner and is also a resident. And he told us about what he's been experiencing when it comes to tourism. Have a listen to Brett.
This is the oldest city in the country, so we've had our share of tourists before, but nothing like this. In the last years, this town has become a nightmare for locals. We've had the worst traffic we've ever seen. There's hardly any parking at the beach. And the tourists here have no respect for us or the community, leaving garbage everywhere. Not to mention, many of the locals that have lived here on the beach for years now have to move inland due to the fact the rising costs of living here on the island. And now it's new hotels, condos, restaurants, and bars have covered our beautiful once little beach town. And I don't think it'll ever be the same again.
So Megan, you could see what he laid out there. When we talk about over-tourism, is this what we're talking about?
Well, over-tourism is a journalistic term that does relate primarily to crowding. So yes, we are seeing some of the most beautiful places on Earth becoming increasingly overcrowded. Yes, so this is a good example.
Dominic, just remind everybody where you live and the experience as a local who lives where you live.
I live in the Venice region of Italy. I live just slightly outside of the city, which obviously gets pretty busy at times. Although I question whether it's really a crisis. Sometimes I get stuck in an alleyway when I'm rushing to a meeting and it's annoying. But is that really over-tourism?
You have been basically keeping track of examples of Venice saying, do you know what, we're tired with all of these tourists. And this was long before we started to do the show, so I'm just going back, trawling through some of your tweets. 23-year-old Canadian fined €250 for sunbathing in a bikini in public gardens in Venice. That's one story you kept track of. 2 British tourists fined €350 in Venice for being bare-chested and pushing their bikes by hand in the city centre, where bikes are banned. One more, but you've kept track of so many more. First 3 people banned from Venice are foreigners for playing tricks on passers-by. Dominic, what is going on in Venice with tourists? Have Venetians had enough of the tourists coming to visit them?
Well, I think a very straightforward thing has happened, which is that for years and years, tourists have been increasingly treated as environmental and cultural hazards. And Venice has taken it a step further, or Venice City Council in particular, with these new regulations introduced in May. And essentially what they're doing is they're criminalising fairly normal behaviour. So sunbathing in a park like that Canadian woman, it's a public place, she's wearing a bikini, and she gets fined. Walking around with your shirt off, pushing a bike, you're not really troubling anyone. But again, people are getting fined, and they're also getting banished from the city. 2 German tourists recently who were making coffee on a small portable coffee maker, totally out of the way of other people, no evidence of littering. They not only got fined, but they got banished from the city. So I think this is a real problem that, and it's not only in Venice, you see in Barcelona now. If you walk around in your bathing costume in the centre of Barcelona, you can be fined. In Rome, you can even now be fined for dressing as a centurion or singing on public transport or eating food in non-designated outside areas. Does that also mean an ice cream?
I need a rule book to go to Rome now, Malika.
Well, I think listeners and people on social media need to be aware of this, because unaware tourists are going to places and they're getting hefty fines and travel bans. It's frightening.
Okay, yeah, I have a comment, because I appreciate your viewpoints on the sociology of tourism, which I know is your expertise, but there's a lot bigger picture here to deal with for the readers and folks that are watching this today. And that is that the rapid growth of tourism is creating a whole new paradigm for destinations. Now, they may be struggling with putting in the right type of regulations, which is what you're talking about. But I think what you're saying is minimizing the problem in a way that will harm the overall process. Because what we need to do is come up with a much more alert way of managing the intensifying crowds. And I disagree with you. This is a global crisis. I'm sure that Shoidi can speak to the issues in India, say, for example, at some of the most important monuments in the world, like Taj Mahal.
Yeah. So, just to, put things in perspective, recently there were limitations that were applied in India, and visitors have been, even local visitors have now coughed up about 250 rupees, up from just 50 rupees to visit the monument. And there is a cap of about 40,000 visitors a day and a 3-hour limit. So anybody who exceeds the 3-hour limit has to pay once again. And you can imagine how livid the locals who might be, all the Indians visiting might be, that they have to buy another ticket to just stay on for 3.5 hours if they've exceeded it by half an hour. But it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, if you have 7 million tourists coming in to see one monument, and it's just it's relentless. I think there is need for regulation, and you may have identified a few things that seem particularly it's a bit overmuch for you, but it depends on which culture you're in. So it could be actually deeply disrespectful in India to be walking around bare chested in the northern parts of India, but if you walk into a temple in southern India as a man, that's absolutely fine. So those are nuances that somebody who's coming in for a few days into India may not necessarily be aware of, and that kind of disrespect is, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick comment, because just today, headlines in the United States was that there's a huge water crisis in India in some of the most important tourism destinations. Now, we already know that tourism and tourists in particular use about 8 to 10 times the amount of water that a local would use. And sometimes, depending on the resort, it can be even much more. So from the public health perspective, for example, we're beginning to see a different kind of crisis that is not just about crowding. It's about how do we share resources around the world. Now, we see this in India. Bali is another epicenter of this problem, where we're seeing tourists literally use water that locals can no longer gain access to. Now, these are serious problems that we can't minimize by way of just discussing whether we wear bikini tops or not.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to share a comment. I want to get in here because I want to share a comment on YouTube. There's so many comments coming in live right now because so many people can relate to this topic. So I want to share just one of them. This from Alexander, who says, my city of 150,000 people will receive close to 400 cruise ships this year. The city is overwhelmed. And he's speaking to us from Stavanger, Norway, and other people are weighing in on what he's saying. So that's just one example. But when it comes to the cruise ships and it comes to the crowds of people coming in, here's what Sophia ventured to say. Limit visits to the city to certain times of the year. This would also allow the city to continue to function as a home for people in Venice. Probably would never happen. However, I know of no place that implements this, but Venice can start. Dominic, I'll give this one.
I have a major, if I could jump in.
Go ahead. Clearly you have a lot to say on this. Go ahead.
Here we go, is that basically a lot of people are now talking about stopping or halting or seasonalizing it. And our new report, Invisible Burden of Tourism, looks seriously at how we're going to handle capacity, not by stopping or abrupt stopping of tourism, but rather at creating sophisticated reservation systems. Now, we may have to, work through that question of how that will work. But there is no question that there is a very sophisticated set of tools that are fully available to monuments, cities, cruise lines, everyone. It's a shareable tool that airlines and use now that's called demand management. And there is absolutely no reason that destinations around the world can't use that.
Dominic, go ahead.
Yeah, of course, tourism can be managed better. And in the case of Venice, I'm very much in favour of creating a new docking port for cruise ships outside the Venice Lagoon and getting people into the city using a subway train system, which I think would be a huge improvement to the experience of tourism, controlling the flows, and also it would be much better for the environment because it would reduce boat journeys all around the lagoon. So we can manage tourism a lot better. Coming back to Suiti's point, I agree that culturally, where you walk around with a shirt off or on, it's important to be sensitive, and I wouldn't attempt to walk into St. Mark's Church with my shirt off. But of course, it's a different context in the gardens. I've also got a question, though. You mentioned this charge for people in New Delhi to go and see sites. And that's an important question because Venice is proposing an entrance charge to the city next year for day trippers even arriving in the city. And I wonder to what extent you feel that also discriminates against poorer tourists, whether they're local or from elsewhere.
So I agree that that it could be seen as a discriminatory, but look at our numbers. We are just if you look at domestic tourism in India alone is a huge problem, because we have over 600 million people who are roughly in the middle class range, and they are traveling. Everybody's traveling. So it is going to take time for us to arrive at the right solutions, but they are also trying to make it accessible to as many people as possible. 50 rupees is the basic entrance fee for the average Indian tourist anywhere in most of our monuments, or 150 rupees at best. So it's not a huge sum for somebody who's looking to travel. And from what I have been told, I mean, our figures are spectacular. 150 million people can afford long distance travel for leisure, I'm told. And 500 million people are on the internet, and they're booking holidays, beginning to book holidays on the internet. So these numbers are only going to swell. So maybe pricing is not the only solution.
So let me just bring in another point. Megan, hold tight for a moment, because I want to share this with you, and then you can weigh in on it. Part of the growth of people who are travelling comes from the developing world. The developed world have been travelling for many years, but there's a new category of tourists, and it's something that our colleagues at 101 East looked at. They were looking at the number of Chinese tourists coming into Paris and heading into France, and then the tension that was creating with the numbers and also the difference in the culture. Have a look at Eileen Callan's report from Paris, from 101 East.
They don't say hello, they don't speak English, they don't speak French, they only speak Chinese. When you have 10 people, Chinese people coming, it's very noisy, and I don't understand.
But she says what really gets to her is the spitting.
I had a woman, she came, and she sit down, and she, I don't know the name in English, in the floor. And you're like, wow.
So that's one example. If I'm thinking about the south of Spain and the number of Europeans in the south of Spain, where you can get a full English breakfast, there are toasties that you can eat. The British culture's totally changed the south of Spain and parts of the south of Spain. So it's not just developing world countries who actually do this to an area. Is this a problematic, or is this just how we are around the world? We visit different places, we influence different places. Shweti, you start first.
Sure. I mean, bad behavior is bad behavior. It's bad tourist is, tourist who's insensitive is an insensitive tourist. It has nothing to do with whether you're from a developing nation or not. I understand that, cultural differences can make it harder to bridge that gap. And, that's the biggest barrier. But at the end of the day, I think it would be very, very wrong to just say that this is a problem that is restricted to tourists from developing nations.
It's more from the increase of who is travelling from around the world. It's not just a few elite people. It's many other countries and cultures all getting into the mix. Megan, your take?
Yeah, it's part of globalization. I think we've seen the history of tourism showing us that it used to be Korean tourists that bothered folks that were in Indonesia, or when I was in the Philippines doing workshops, there was complaints from the Filipinos about Chinese tourists. So these are parts of just countries mixing for the first time. But what we've also seen is that as tourists become more sophisticated, they become more respectful.
So I wanted to share this as an explanation for why we are seeing greater numbers of people out and about in all these places. This is Justin on Twitter, who says the three biggest reasons for the growth in hotspots are the artificially low cost of aviation, the fuel is not taxed, the rise in the middle classes in developing countries, and a narrow focus on places generated by Instagram and social media. Of course, the rise of the hashtag and the rise of people tagging where they are. So I wanted to share with you this this idea from someone on Instagram. I posted this picture from Malta, which is one of these places where tourists are flocking to because many of its spots were featured in the Game of Thrones. Someone wrote back and said, have you been following the concept of no geotagging? I just came across it through a photojournalist. Apparently it's been making the rounds to address how geotags suddenly make previously untouched by tourist spots flooded, all to ostensibly capture that one shot, bringing all the environmental chaos that tourists bring to a locale. So that is one idea. But I wanted to share with you one more idea, and this is via a video comment from Neil, who speaks to us from Scotland. Have a listen.
On the topic of overtourism, and specifically with Scotland in mind, the solutions revolve around two key things as far as I can see. Firstly, it's the need to disperse traffic throughout the course of the calendar year. We are very, very busy in July and August, and it's about trying to encourage people to come in the shoulder seasons and even in the winter as well for a different kind of experience with less crowds. Secondly, it's about trying to encourage people away from the typical tourist routes. The set itineraries for Scotland tend to involve Edinburgh, Skye, Loch Ness and parts of the North Coast 500. As a result, those places are particularly heaving and fit to burst in the busy season. So if people consider the alternatives, and there are plenty of them within Scotland, to each of those locations, we can spread that traffic and spread the love across the whole country. If we can do that, we can really get tourism working for the whole economy, both in the short term and sustainably in the long term as well. So
Dominic, encouraging people to go to other spots. What's your take on those list of suggestions?
Yeah, I like those last comments about developing transport systems to move people around better. And I emphasize very much that we need development to enable that. You also mentioned Malta. I was speaking at a conference on overtourism there actually in the fall. And one of the key problems there is that the roads get very jammed with traffic because they haven't got a train system at all. They stopped an ancient train system. And that would really, really help move people around better in Malta. So I think we need to look positively about how to respond to the challenges. And you mentioned the growth in tourism as projected. The numbers that you gave from the UN World Tourism Organization earlier in the program are quite interesting, because if you look at that increase in international travellers from 25 million in 1950 to 1.3 billion in 2017, that's over a 5,000% increase. The projected increase in those figures to 2030 is 1.8 billion, which is only 38% more. I think we can cope.
Yeah, but Dominic,
if we plan well. If we plan well.
That. Yeah, we're already exceeding that. Yes, and also another very important point is that domestic tourism is not included in those figures. And in most places, you would see, as we've just discussed for India, a large percentage of tourists in developed and many developing economies is from the domestic scene. So as one of the challenges of the Scottish comment is that the overall growth rate is probably going to overwhelm the dispersion strategy. I'm working with Scotland, and they have now beginning to put in place what I would call management systems on the ground. We just can't count on marketing and new ways of marketing to fix this problem. We have to look at the impacts in a scientific manner and work with government so that we make sure that local resources, both social and environmental, are not overwhelmed.
So Megan and Shweti and Dominic, we're in the very last minute of the program. We could talk about tourism and traveling for much, much longer. If you were going to give us one piece of advice about how to be a responsible tourist, what would it be? And it has to be brief. Dominic, you go first.
Welcome people, don't regulate, don't treat people like criminals, and enjoy the cultural education rather than seeing people as problems.
What's your advice for being a responsible tourist?
Open your heart and mind. There are many, many inspired ideas that are coming out. People are doing firefly trips. They're doing astro-tourism in smaller villages, outside of the concentrated
Shweti, you're
areas.
full of advice. Thank you so much. Let's leave a little space for Megan. Go on. How can I be a responsible tourist, Megan?
I think that you should advocate that your tourism tax dollars go to protection of destinations.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Megan and Shweti and Dominic. Our conversation will continue online. You'll find Malika and I at ajstream on Twitter. Thank you, guests. Thanks for watching. See you next time.